Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. First thing I want to do is to wish you a very happy Valentine's Day if you happen to celebrate it. This year, unfortunately, I'm spending it on my own, so if you are watching this video on Valentine's Day, I just wanted to thank you for spending this time with me. So a few months ago, I told you that I had just gotten a copy of Eric Segal's Love Story and that I wanted to explore this book at some point. So here I am, just about to do that, just about to share some ideas with you on my experience reading this book. And I wanted to let you know that this video is going to be the first of a series. So this is going to be a podcast on one of my favorite topics ever, which is, of course, love. I am a hopeless romantic. I do believe that love is the most powerful force in the universe. And I just want to see where this goes. You know, I've been wanting to make videos on this topic for a very long time. So I'm just going to see what happens, and I hope you enjoy whatever it is that I happen to do as a part of this podcast on this wonderful topic. So let's look first, looking at Love Story, the book and the author. In this video, we're also going to talk about the movie, okay? So I do want to show you that, but first of all, we're going to look at the book, and then we'll talk a little bit about the movie and kind of mix things up a little bit as we go. So Love Story was published in 1970, and it was an immediate success. This was really a bestseller. But before it was a book, it was a screenplay. So that is really very interesting. Eric Segal, he had this screenplay and he was trying to get it accepted, right? As most people who have a screenplay do. But it kept being rejected. So somebody told him, why don't you turn it into a novel? He did, and it was a great success. So guess what happened after that? It eventually became a movie. So it went from being a screenplay to being a novel, back to being a screenplay. The movie was also a very big hit. It was nominated for an Academy Award even. So we have a really, really successful little book and movie right here. Really, really cool stuff about the author. Eric Segal had a PhD by the time that he wrote this book. He went to Harvard and he was also a runner. So there is a connection there with the main character of this book. And something also that I found really, really interesting is that Segal also collaborated in the script for Yellow Submarine. Yes, the Beatles film. So we have some interesting information about him right there. Now, I have been talking about Love Story as if this were a novel. I am conscious that I have used that term. But guess what? That is incorrect, because Love Story is not a novel. It is a novella. Of course, you were expecting that from me. It is only 130 pages in length, but as you know, and as I have said before many, many times, when it comes to genre, page count has very, very little to do with it. We are talking more importantly here about structure. So the key thing is the structure. And in this case, what we have is an episodic structure. We have a little novella that could be titled Scenes from a Romance. So we have little scenes and we follow this couple as they develop. And also, we have something really interesting here that the novella as a genre tends to do. If you look at the very first sentence of this text, it says, "What can you say about a 25-year-old girl who died?" Okay, so we have one of those spoiler beginnings, right? Sometimes the spoiler is in the very title, like the death of Ivan Ilyich. This is a spoiler in the very first sentence. We know how the story is going to end, right? So the novella most of the time is not really based on plot. Plot is not the most important, it's not the foundation of the text, if you will, when it comes to the novella. And actually, if you look at this great book by Deleuze and Guattari, A Thousand Plateaus, it's the second part of Capitalism and Schizophrenia. The first one is titled Anti-Oedipus, as you may know. They have a little essay here about the novella as a genre. And if you go to page 192, I believe, in my copy, here it says, it begins by saying, "It is not very difficult to determine the essence of the novella as a literary genre. Everything is organized around the question, what happened? Whatever could have happened." So if you look at a short story, most of the time what you wonder is what is going to happen, right? And sometimes in the novel it's the same thing. They say that the novel combines elements from the short story and from the novella, and that is definitely true. So the question here for the novella is in the past, what happened, okay? So we know that she dies in the end, so how did we get to that place? The great novella by Ernesto Sabato, The Tunnel. First sentence, the guy is telling us that he killed his love interest, right? So once again, the question, what happened? How did he get to that point? I was reading another one recently, Natalia Ginzburg's The Dry Heart. Okay, the woman shoots her husband. Once again, what happened? How did we get there? So you get that definitely with Love Story, because from the very start, we know how the story is going to end. So let me tell you a little bit about the plot here. Love Story is the story of Oliver Barrett IV and Jennifer Cavallari. They are college students living in Boston, and the story is narrated by Oliver. So I'll tell you maybe a little bit more about the narrator as we go, because he is a very interesting narrator. Oliver is a hockey player. Okay, he is filthy rich, and he goes to Harvard because he has family connections with Harvard College, the university. While on the other hand, we have Jenny, who is a musician. She is of more humble origins, and she goes to Radcliffe. Now, here's a very interesting piece of trivia about that. Radcliffe eventually, in 1999, merged with Harvard University. So, just an interesting piece of information right there. At the time of the story, they were separate colleges. So they meet at the library, which is where Jenny works. I was thinking, that would be the ideal place for me to meet my soulmate. I wish, it would happen like that, or maybe at Half Price Books, because I basically live there. But to be honest with you, at this point, I really don't care where I meet her. It would be really nice to find her finally. But anyway, for Oliver, it's the whole thing is pretty much love at first sight. Okay, if we can believe in love at first sight. We're definitely going to talk about that at some point. Whereas Jenny is more down to earth, and she is much more aware of the obstacles between them. So they persevere, right? But at the end, as the first sentence in the novella tells us, she dies. Okay, so that's basically, in a nutshell, the plot of Love Story. Now, before we go into the analysis of that, let me share with you guys some information about the film, because I think this is also something that we should consider. It's a very successful film, very popular. It was also released in 1970, so it was immediately after that, directed by Arthur Hiller, and of course starring Ryan O'Neal and Ali MacGraw. Now, not surprisingly, it follows the novella very closely. And as I said, it started as a screenplay, so really there's no element of surprise here. Now, the order of some of the scenes has been changed, and that is maybe one of the main differences that I found in my experience of just reading the text and then watching the film. And there are two very important additions when it comes to scenes that are not in the book. The first one is a scene where both of them are playing in the snow. Okay, and the other one is a scene in which the character of Jenny is watching Oliver as he ice skates. We have some really nice juxtaposed shots right there, superimposed, right? So you see her face looking at him and him skating. So it's very, very nicely done. And both of these scenes are just, endearing, I would say. They are silent. All you have is that wonderful music by Francis Lay. And I think that music really does a very, very good job. By the way, the music won an Academy Award. And it makes these scenes really poignant and unforgettable. So they work really, really well. Now, another thing that I liked about the movie was the way the dinner with the Barretts scene was done. I thought it was really nicely done. So they get to the Barretts' house, and they are about to have dinner, and Oliver all of a sudden says, hey, we can't stay for that long. And immediately after that, we cut, and we see Oliver and Jenny in the car going back home. So you see what I'm saying? It's really, on the way back, they're talking about the dinner, and we have their talk about the dinner superimposed or alternating with shots of the actual dinner. And it really emphasizes the fact that this was something uncomfortable for them. It was something really quick. As soon as they get there, Oliver is like, hey, we can't stay for long. And all of a sudden, it cuts to them going back home. So it really emphasizes the brief, the nature, the brevity, and the uncomfortable nature of this talk that they had with his family. Now, another thing that I wanted to emphasize is this. There's a slight change when it comes to the ending. Okay, not the ending itself. She dies in the end, okay, just as she does in the story. And we also know in the film that that is going to happen from the very first line, because we do have a narrator in the film. But I'm talking about the very last sentence in the novella. Okay, so I'm not going to spoil this for you, but look at that very last sentence. that is different in the film. So something to look out for there. Okay, let's talk about love. Okay, I promised you that we were going to talk about this great topic, so let's talk about their relationship. If you read the novella, their relationship seems to develop really, really quickly, and this is, of course, to some extent due to the episodic nature of the story that we have right here. So after their second date, Oliver calls Jenny on the phone, and he says something to the effect that he thinks he is in love with her. And to this, she replies, "You're full of you know what," right? Now, I think at this point, she is actually right, I'm going to say. I think at this point, we cannot really say, second date. I don't think we can really speak of love with all the letters, as we say in Spanish. And you may be like, "Jorge, what's the matter with you? Don't you believe in love at first sight?" That's a really, really interesting topic. It's a complicated issue that we're definitely going to explore in a future video. But right now, let me say this. I think in order for it to be love with all the letters, once again, in order to love someone, I believe that you have to know them first to a certain extent. Okay, because then the question comes, to what extent is it possible to know another person? To what extent is it possible to know ourselves even? You know what I'm saying? It gets really, really philosophical. At first sight, you may have an attraction. You may have an intuition that this is the one, right? And after that, it may develop into love. And then in retrospect, you may think, well, I knew from the very start, so it was love at first sight. But let me for the moment just say that in this case, I think that Jenny is correct in saying that it is not really love at this point. Now, don't get me wrong, Jenny is wonderful. Okay, she really is wonderful. I mean, on page 28 of this novella, we learn that she has read Proust. Yes, Marcel Proust. Okay, so I would just propose to her just based on that, to be honest with you. But on the other hand, and this is really the interesting part of the story that I think appeals to many people because it makes it more down to earth, there's a lot of bantering between Oliver and Jenny in this relationship that involves quite a bit of profanity. Okay, for example, she calls him an SOB, he calls her a B, things like that. Okay, and I would say, of course, to each his own, but if you ask me, I don't know, that part didn't really appeal to me. I'm not gonna call my soulmate a B, and I hope that she's not gonna call me an SOB, so I think that part, to me, it didn't really speak to me. But at the same time, I think that the naturalness with which these very natural words come out, makes it easier for people to relate to the story. And I think that appealed to many people. After all, Oliver and Jenny are ordinary people. He is rich, of course, but then there are rich people out there. So I guess in that sense, that is what I mean when I say these are real characters. These are people that so many viewers of the film and so many readers of the novella were able to connect with because of that naturalness and because of that ordinary nature of the characters, as far as you can say that somebody is ordinary, as I always say. So what about that famous quote? Okay, in the movie it's a little bit different. Okay, you have love means never having to say you're sorry. In the novella is love means not ever having to say you're sorry. So there's a little bit of a change right there in the wording, but to the effect of the same thing, right? So we don't really have a change when it comes to that. Now, if you take that to mean that in a relationship you can do whatever you want and hurt the other person as much as you want and you never have to apologize, I don't think that makes much sense, really, does it? Okay, so I don't think that's what they meant. Here, what we have to consider is that this is not, the phrase doesn't go, love means never saying you're sorry, but love means not ever having to say you're sorry. So another way to look at it is that if you love the person so much, you would never do anything to hurt them. You would never do anything that would require you in the first place to say that you're sorry. Does the line make more sense if you look at it that way? I would say that it does, definitely, but at the same time, that is highly idealistic, isn't it? I mean, even with the best of intentions, sooner or later, we are going to mess up, even if it is in some detail, like, I don't know, you accidentally lock the person outside of the house, or you accidentally leave the toilet seat up, things like that. You know what I mean? That's going to happen. And you could argue at the same time, based on that, that, well, those are details, so it's not really necessary to apologize. Now, I personally think that it's very, very important to apologize, even in the details, because you never know how the other person is going to feel. People have different ways of reacting to things. Some people are more sensitive than others. So I think at the bottom line here, unfortunately, that famous quote doesn't really make much sense to me. And actually, Ali MacGraw said the same thing. I'm just paraphrasing her here, but I think she said that that idea, love means never having to say you're sorry, is kind of nonsense. So it's really up to you whether you accept it or not. An interesting thing about this novella is that, like many other novellas, Love Story is a double story. The main thread of the story right here is, of course, the relationship between Oliver and Jenny. That is the most important. But as you know, and as C.S. Lewis explored in a wonderful book, love has many meanings, right? There are many kinds of love. So a very important part of this novella also has to do with the relationship between Oliver and his father, whose name is also Oliver. So that is something that you want to look out, because this relationship also develops as you see the development of the relationship between Oliver and Jenny. The same thing happens with the film. Okay, so that is one of those cases in which also the two of them are quite close. Now I want to talk about some connections with other texts, okay? And I want you to know that in this case there are going to be spoilers, because in this one we know exactly how it's going to end, but in some of the similar texts we don't. Okay, so when I am spoiling or talking about other texts, I'm going to raise my hand like this so that you can skip that part. So one thing that's going to stand out, and maybe even bother many readers, is the notion that we have here of the vulnerable female. Okay, there are many, many stories that include this. Jenny is independent, she is a very strong character, but she still dies in the end. So I was thinking about some other texts, okay, and this is where the spoilers come. For example, I thought of The Truce, La Tregua, by Mario Benedetti, okay? Same situation we have there. I was thinking maybe of Victoria by Knut Hamsun. There's also A Walk to Remember by Nicholas Sparks, if you want to go with something more, bestseller type of text. Also, we could mention maybe The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. Okay, so those are texts in which you have very similar endings to the story, and here the spoilers end. So in that sense, I think you could say that Love Story is really not that original a story, because there are so many others where this happens. Now, at the same time, we know from the very start that Jenny is going to die. So that really adds a layer of interest to the story. Once again, the question is what happened? Okay, what happened to her? How did we come to that outcome? So the story it's not really exploitative or cheap, because it tells us from the very start how it's going to end. So we keep asking ourselves that question. And here's another thing that I thought was interesting when it comes to this trope of the vulnerable female. Oliver is definitely vulnerable too, for sure. And he shows his vulnerability quite a bit because he is the narrator. So you see, in that sense, I think this is a book that negotiates that problematic trope in a really good way, So I definitely wanted to give it credit for that. Now, my general impressions, I would say that Love Story is an okay novella, okay? I felt, on the other hand, that maybe Mario Benedetti's The Truce dealt with the topic in a way that was a little bit more profound. It's a longer text, just about, I'm not saying twice as long, but almost twice as long. But that one focuses on a very different aspect of things. Here in Love Story, what we have is a problem of social class, primarily. In the case of The Truce, what we have is two lovers who are divided by their age. So there's a big age difference between them. So keep that in mind also when comparing these two. And I think that if you're going to go with this vulnerable female character, I thought that, for example, Nicholas Sparks' A Walk to Remember did a better job when it comes to that, because there you also have a female character that is definitely vulnerable in the physical sense, but also very strong. And I think the lovers, I remember this in that book and in that movie, they're not cussing each other out all the time. So that was a plus for me. So that's why maybe that one is a little bit closer to me as a story. Now, many people are going to love this story of love between real people. It's a kind of Romeo and Juliet of the Cold War US, you know, with this idea of them being separated in the end. And regarding that, you know, regarding her death, I would say that the novella, if you look at it like beyond that, beyond the fact of death, it is really about loss. So in that sense, anybody who has experienced the breakup, you know, and how painful that can be, will be able to channel that and connect with the story at some level. Of course, it's not the same thing to lose a loved one to a breakup than to lose them to, you know, death. Of course, there's definitely a huge difference right there. But at least there's a point of connection that we can have, you know, if we have experienced this kind of loss when it comes to relationship, for example. So the bottom line to me is that Love Story is not really a mind-blowing text. I would not call it that by any means. But it is such a brief text. I mean, you can read it in a day. And I think it's a good, honest story that has aged pretty well too. You know, we're talking about 1970, so it's over 50 years now, if my math is correct. Don't take my word for it because I'm not good at math. But I'm going to say give it a chance. Okay, give this book a chance. The good thing about novellas is that they are really brief. So even if you don't absolutely love it, you know what I'm saying? It's like they're a quick read and you haven't wasted a lot of time. If you don't like, I don't know, The Magic Mountain, if you don't like War and Peace, then yeah, you do have, you know, good reason to be angry. That's another story. But with novellas, it's just great. And then one thing that I didn't really cover that much, but I don't want to make this video too long either. The narrator. Okay, I mentioned him briefly. Oliver is a really witty narrator. He is great at sarcasm. Okay, his sense of irony is really good. So maybe if you don't enjoy the story itself, at least you can enjoy the novella at that level, the level of the narrator, which is really a lot of fun when it comes to this one. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on Love Story by Eric Segal, the book, and the movie by Arthur Hiller. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.